The dust in Oakhaven didn't just settle on your clothes, it worked its way under your skin, into your teeth, and deep down into your spirit until you forgot what green ever looked like. For 3 straight years, the sun had beaten the valley into a cracked, pale wasteland. The old riverbed was nothing more than a winding scar of baked clay, and the heat shimmery off the blacktop could make a sane man see lakes where there were only stones. Most of the old farming families had already signed away their deeds to Vantage Agribusiness, taking pennies on the dollar just to escape the slow death of their dirt. But Arthur Miller stayed. Arthur was 62, with hands like knotted oak and a back that bent slightly to the left from 40 years of hauling irrigation lines. His farm, a modest 80-acre plot nestled right at the base of the ridge, was the last family-owned patch left in the county. On a blisteringly hot Tuesday afternoon, 3 dust-covered pickup trucks belonging to the neighboring estate owners pulled up along Arthur's sagging barbed wire fence. The men inside didn't even bother turning off their engines. They leaned out of their air-conditioned cabs, holding cold cans of beer, pointing at Arthur's withered, bone-dry cornfield. The stalks were brown, paper-thin, and rustled like dead leaves in the hot wind. The men laughed, a loud, mean, hollow sound that echoed off the dry hills. They mocked his stubbornness, asking him if he was trying to grow dust or if he was waiting for a miracle from heaven. Arthur didn't yell back. He just stood at the edge of his porch, wiped the sweat from his brow with a greasy rag, and stared at them through hollow, tired eyes. When they finally drove off, kicking up a blinding cloud of silt, Arthur turned, walked into his tool shed, and locked the door behind him. He didn't come out for 2 days. The town gossip at the local diner was that Arthur had finally broken. People assumed he was packing his bags or worse, sitting alone in the dark with a bottle. But on the 3rd night, a strange sound began to hum across the quiet valley, a low, mechanical thrum that vibrated through the dry soil. Late-night drivers on the state route reported seeing a flickering yellow light moving slowly across Arthur's back property, way up where the rocky soil met the dense timberline of the ridge. Nobody farmed up there, the ground was solid granite and shale. Yet, night after night, the distant clinking of iron against rock cut through the silence of the valley. A few curious neighbors tried to peek over the fence with binoculars, but Arthur had strung up thick tarps along the tree line. What was a broke, bankrupt farmer digging for in a dried-up graveyard of rocks? There was no groundwater up on the ridge, the state surveyors had proven that 30 years ago. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he'd lost his mind and was digging his own grave, others whispered that his grandfather had buried gold under the old ridge line during the Great Depression. The head scout for Vantage Agribusiness even drove up Arthur's driveway with a final cash offer, but Arthur simply pointed a mud-stained finger toward the road without saying a word. His fingernails were split, his forearms covered in deep, red scratches, and his eyes burned with a terrifying, silent focus. By the end of the 2nd week, the weather reached a suffocating climax. The temperature hit a record 108 degrees. The air was so thick with dust that the sun burned like a bruised orange in the sky. All around Arthur's property, the valley was entirely dead. The corporate fields were dry mud, their massive motorized pivots sitting useless because the deep wells had finally pumped up pure sludge. That was the evening Arthur made his move. Armed with a rusty, heavy-duty mattock and an old hand-welded trenching spade, he walked out to the far northern edge of his land. He began to dig furiously, ignoring the blisters bursting on his palms and the blood soaking through his work gloves. He wasn't just turning dirt, he was following a faded, hand-drawn map tucked inside a plastic sleeve in his pocket, dated 1954. The map had belonged to his father, a man the town had once cast out as a lunatic. As the moon rose over the suffocating valley, Arthur's shovel finally struck something hard, not rock, but a dull, metallic thunk that resonated deep under the earth. He dropped to his knees, clawing away the parched soil with his bare hands until the moonlight caught the glint of heavily corroded, industrial-grade iron. It was an enormous, forgotten junction pipe, buried 4 feet beneath the shale, running silently from an untouched, deep mountain reservoir that didn't exist on any modern map. The corroded iron surface was cold to the touch, colder than any groundwater should have been in the middle of a 100-degree drought. Arthur cleared away the last layer of compacted clay to reveal a heavy, cast-iron valve, rusted shut and sealed with a heavy brass padlock from a bygone era. Attached to the lock was a faded steel tag stamped with the crest of the old State Water Board from 1952. This wasn't just a natural subterranean spring or a forgotten well. It was the terminal release valve of the county's original, classified bypass line, emergency water reserve built by the federal government during the Cold War to supply the nearby military outpost, long since decommissioned and erased from local municipal maps. When Vantage Agribusiness bought up the valley's water rights 5 years prior, they had drained the municipal lakes and forced the local farmers out by controlling the surface rivers. They believed they owned every drop of moisture in the county. But they didn't know about the Cold War valve sitting 4 feet under Arthur's useless shale ridge. His father hadn't been a lunatic when he spent his final years babbling about the Ghost River under the mountain. He had been the chief civil engineer who poured the concrete casing and hid the keys when the army abandoned the site. Arthur pulled a heavy steel key from around his neck, the only heirloom his father had left him besides the mortgage, and fitted it into the brass lock. With a sharp snap, the ancient lock gave way. Arthur threw his full body weight against the iron wheel. It groaned, metallic screeching echoing through the empty hills, until finally, with a violent shudder, the rusted valve turned. A deep, roaring rumble shuddered through the earth beneath Arthur's boots, like a sleeping giant waking up deep within the mountain shale. Seconds later, the pipe burst open at the secondary pressure release 30 yards downhill, spraying a roaring, 60-foot geyser of ice-cold, pristine mountain water straight into the night sky. The torrent roared through Arthur's hand-dug trenches, cascading down the dry slopes and flooding into his parched ditches, saturating the cracked earth with thousands of gallons of pure, life-giving water. By morning, the news had swept through the valley like wildfire. The same neighboring farmers who had laughed at Arthur's dry stalk stood lined up along his perimeter fence in utter shock. Behind them sat the regional directors of Vantage Agribusiness in their sleek black SUVs, watching helplessly as Arthur's dry ditch transformed into a rushing, crystal-clear river. Because the pipe was located on an unmapped federal utility easement registered under his father's original land contract, Arthur didn't just find water, he held the legal title to the entire subterranean reserve. Vantage couldn't touch it, shut it off, or sue him for it. Instead of turning off the flow or charging his neighbors a single cent for the water, Arthur opened the floodgates completely, routing the river through every dry, suffocating plot in the entire valley, bringing back to life the very farms the corporate giants had tried to starve out. That afternoon, as the corporate scouts drove away in defeat and his neighbors stood ankle-deep in the cool, flowing mud crying tears of gratitude, Arthur walked slowly to the edge of his porch. He sat down on the steps, bathed in the cool mist drifting off the newly formed stream. He picked up a handful of dark, rich, wet earth, squeezed it tightly in his palm, and looked up at the quiet mountains rising behind his home. They thought they were buying up our dirt, but they forgot that some roots go deeper than any price tag.